Good morning. I'm Glenn Lowry, and I'm the director of the Museum of Modern Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this preview of our extraordinary exhibition on Joaquín Torres-García, curated by Luis Enrique Perez Oramas, the Estrellita Brodsky curator, Latin American art here at the museum. Projects like this are always team efforts, and this one certainly couldn't have happened without an enormous amount of support, and I just want to recognize a number of people and institutions that enable this. First and foremost, Patty Cisneros and Gustavo Cisneros, who have been fairy godmother and fairy godfather to so many things Latin American here. Their support is incalculable, and I think I just saw Patty walk in, and I just want to say, Patty, to you and to Gustavo, our deep and profound thanks for not just your support of this exhibition, but for your support of all things Latin America here. To the Grodauschik family and the Aeropuerto de Carrasco, to Estrellita and Daniel Brodsky, and to our own International Council, deep and profound thanks for joining this effort to bring Torres-Garcia's work to the fore here at the Museum of Modern Art. Other support that was absolutely essential to this project came from the Presidencia de la República Oriental del Uruguay, the Consulate General of Spain in New York, and we're delighted that representatives are here, the Institut Ramon Llull, and we are delighted to have Ambassador Cancela of Uruguay and Itziar Taboada of Spain with us this morning because this exhibition, I think, symbolizes the kind of international cooperation required to show a great artist at his very best. To Luis, to Karen Grimson, curatorial assistant on this project, and to the many, many, many others here at the Museum of Modern Art across the institution, in the preparators, the registrars, the lawyers, the manifold staff that enabled this project. We're deeply and profoundly grateful. Before Luis and I enjoy a conversation, just want to say that the exhibition will travel to the Espacio Fundación Telefónica in Madrid in May of 2016, and then to the Musée Picasso in Malaga in October of 2016. So we're excited to have such an interesting international tour. Now, formalities over, we can have some fun. Luis.
So, Glenn.
Torres-Garcia.
Yes.
Who was he?
Well, you know who was he. Torres was, I remember having with you a conversation years ago about, we were in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, and
exactly.
There was this small exhibition of Torres there, and Glenn told me, we have to find a time for Torres at MoMA. Torres was, and the fact that you had acknowledged, the Uruguayan government, the Spanish government, the Catalonian institutions, Torres-Garcia was a really global artist avant la lettre. And he was a genius who never stopped migrating. And I think in a world that is confronting migration as a major issue, here we have someone who understood that forms and art always migrates, and that if it does not migrate, then it stands frozen. And Torres-Garcia, in that sense, was one of the major contributors to the incredible dialogue between Europe and America and the Americas that brought forth a different possibility for modernism in the Americas in the 1920s and 30s. He was one of the major contributors to this transference of information between Europe and the Americas. And as such, he is truly one of the foundational figures of modernism in Latin America, certainly, and acknowledged as such since very early on, but also very influential in the US and absolutely key for, at every single moment, in every single art scene where he was, he embodied it entirely and contributed with major works and ideas. And that, I think that makes him particularly timely today.
He was also, it seems to me, in a curious kind of way, for somebody who was such an international traveler and who found a way to be at home in many different places, he was also a quintessentially New York artist.
He was a quintessential New York artist, absolutely. He came to New York in 1920, and in 1920 stayed here for almost 3 years. But the number of contacts and friendships and experiences that he had in New York is really impressive. And he met Mrs. Whitney. He showed with Stuart Davis in 1923. He was immediately hosted by Walter Pax. He really was at the core of what American modernism was in the 1920s. He was at the same time dreaming of being a businessman by building these little toys and establishing a factory of toys, and at the same time having dialogues and contributing to the art scene, the Independent Society of Artists. It was a really, I would say, brief and intense period that ended up in 1923 when he decided to go back to Europe. But then he continued to be in contact with major figures in American art. Catherine Dreyer visited him in Paris later on and continued buying works by him. And then he continued to be in contact with American artists. And he was a truly influential artist. There is this anecdote that Sidney Janis wanted to have this show of Torres, organized this show of Torres in 1949. Unfortunately, Torres passed. But he did that show, he organized that show, and Barney Newman would go every single morning and stay the entire morning looking at Torres' work and explaining to his peers Torres' work. And at that time, Luis Bourgeois would produce works inspired by Torres-Garcia. So he was quite a quintessential artist in America.
One of the things that I think is so striking as you walk through the exhibition is the sense of the archaic. That
yes.
If we talk about American modernism, Stuart Davis, for instance, there's a sense of energy, of a kind of proleptic interest in the future, right? Yeah. Whereas it seems to me that Torres-Garcia found a way to channel the past into his work.
That is key.
Talk about that a little bit.
I'm very happy that you bring forth that, because that's a key issue for Torres. And I'll just start by with a technical, logistic anecdote within the organization of the show. A major painting from 1938 was brought from Caracas, and we know that it's not very easy to bring things from Caracas these days.
Thank goodness your mother came with it.
Okay, exactly. But Annie Aviran, our painting conservator, was a hero of that process. And this is a painting, you will see that in the show. It's a big, large, it's probably the largest abstract painting that Torres ever painted, that apparently had many conservation problems. Once we took a serious look at the work, we understood that Torres had made this paint on canvas with the intention that it looks like an ancient fresco. So it is structurally a modern work, much like this one that is in the screen, but materially it looks like a ruin of antiquity, like an ancient fresco. And this combination of the tectonic and the ancient and the modern structurally is a key problem in the best sense of the word problem, and a major issue and a major contribution of Torres. He very early on understood that temporality is not only linear and successive, but it also deals with sediments and layerings and duration. And he always kept this will to marry, to articulate, the looking forward to the future with the layering of some kind of antiquity and past that, he dared to invent at every single moment in his career. And you see these small, precarious, abstract, constructive structures made in wood, and it's intentionally precarious. And they intentionally look like old things, and they are modern. They were made with Mondrian at this distance.
So let's talk about the wood work for a little bit, because I think for certainly an American audience, we're familiar with his paintings, not unlike this extraordinarily beautiful painting. But the wood, and certainly that's what surprised me in Porto Alegre, was a revelation. And so in the kind of arc of his career, it wasn't, he actually starts with wood very early on, and it continues, although what he does with it changes. So do you want to talk about the dialogue between what he was working on in wood and perhaps how he was painting?
Absolutely. This is also I would say, a conclusion that we came up while organizing the exhibition, is that these small wood constructors, they are generally small, but not all of them are small. I mean, later on in the 1940s, he produced humongous wood structures, and we have a kind of a major, big, beautiful wood from the 1940s in the exhibition. But those woods, those three-dimensional objects, were a way to address painting too. As much as painting, with all these elements that I was mentioning before, was also a way to address the tridimensional production in wood. But definitely the wood were like a laboratory of both formal invention and structural composition. And he began in 1914 producing woods that look like ancient Greek objects. And there is this fashion of Greek, à la Greek art. You can think of the Ballet Russe and L'Après-midi d'Enfant, and there is this moment, but there is also Noucentismo. But immediately after that, he comes to New York, and then there is this ludic laboratory of toys. And the importance of the toys, and that's the way we wanted to stress it in the exhibition, is that they were transformable objects. You could compose them, you could decompose them. So they set a possibility for Torres continuing producing woods that were transformable woods, that were transformable objects. And so he would do that in Paris while looking at indigenous and primitive art, and while looking at neoplasticist art. And then he will continue doing that at the peak of his career, when he kind of come up with his own voice. He would do major a la Torres-Garcia composition, and the next day or the same day he's producing these precarious woods with funny and daring compositions, and he continues up to the end of his life. And one of the contributions of the show is to reinsert in the understanding of the whole career the function and the protagonism of these woods at every moment. Because you can look at the woods as a series outside of the career, which has been done. But then if you insert those woods at the moment when he produced them, and you see what he was also painting at the same time, he was always open to contradictions, and in a very creative way. Then you understand that those woods are a laboratory for formal invention that he continued visiting and until the end of his life.
I want to just switch gears a little bit to make sure we cover the full range of what the exhibition deals with, and talk a little bit about the graphic work in the Livre d'Artiste, because again, one sees this extraordinary sensibility, imagining and maybe even reimagining the possibilities of the page.
Absolutely. I'm very happy, and I have to acknowledge also the contributions and the help and the support of the National Museum Montevideo, but also the Museo Torres-Garcia and the family in Montevideo, who made available to us all those books that are unpublished, and that are really also another form of laboratory for invention. Though all those books that are in vitrines that we were able to scan and that you have in these page turners give you the idea of how Torres really addressed artist books since 1914, 1915, up to the end of his life. And the books were actually, I would say that Torres Glenn is obsessed with symbols and language. And the books are this very intense object where both language and symbols collide. and some of these books are only drawings and only schemes of ideas, and some of them are drawings with long texts and almost manifestos. There is one that is a revelation, and I think is the first time that is being shown, which is titled Structure, was done in Paris in 1932. And this is a wordless book. It's, if you want, a Mnemosyne album by Torres-Garcia, done at the same time, you know, and Avi Warburg was thinking of his Mnemosyne album. And it's just a collection of collages where he collides diagrams, modern images, technical descriptions with primitive art, with architecture, classical architecture, modern art. It's really a wordless manifesto of all the possibilities that and a logical way to think forms and the world can produce. And that book is there. It is scanned, and it's really a revelation. It's a gem.
If you haven't seen it, because it's small and it isn't necessarily something that would jump out at you when you go back up in the exhibition, I would urge you to see it. Because for me, it's actually almost like a dictionary of possibilities for Torres. It's like exactly he's working out every idea. The genesis for every idea is there. But let's talk for a moment about the Arcadian. Right, if we've got if we've established a linkage to the archaic, I think the other side of that is the Arcadian for Torres-Garcia.
Well, there is obviously and you see it when you see the fresco and you see the drawings for the series of frescoes for the Chapel of San Jordi. There is a moment in his production when he embodies the idea of these golden Mediterranean age of classic times that actually he produces in a very flattened way, in a very schematic way. And at the bottom of that huge fresco, he inscribes a phrase that he takes from Goethe that reads, temporality is only but symbol. Temporality is only symbolic, which produced a big scandal in Barcelona in 1916. He understood that, as I was saying before, that at every single moment in time, you have the possibility to look at the future, but also the challenge of understanding what are the remains of past at that moment. And contrary to an idea of passeism, Torres really dared to think that he could invent an original moment at every single present instance. And so it is Greek in 1914, but it is tectonic and almost pre-Columbian in 1938. And then it is primitive and archaic in 1927. So it's really also a migrating form of obsession with this, whatever Arcadian concept is. And I think that makes Torres an absolutely timely artist today, when we know, and contemporary artists know, that forms are not subject to evolution necessarily, or not only subject to evolution, that actually they are the result of conventions, and that we have the freedom of create them at every single time and again, and that every time we create them, we are dealing with both dimensions of time in a durational form. And that is what is fascinating, because in Torres-Garcia, that has a material manifestation in the way, in the decisions he takes about materiality, layering, factura aspect. That aspect is there very, very much present. So we wanted to stress this idea, this contradiction of a modern that is also an Arcadian.
We debated over this for a great deal, but I think it's important, especially when you're looking at some of the work that reads, at least at first glance, as abstract, to realize that the issue of abstraction is not Torres-Garcia's problem.
No.
It's a byproduct
Absolutely.
of a different set of interests, and that's what I wanted you to get at.
This beautiful, this letter. Von Desburg is, von Desburg was a militant, an activist of abstraction, and he wanted to fight against surrealism. And so they start to exchange letters, and at some point, Torres is annoyed by the militantism of von Desburg, and he writes, I don't feel comfortable in exclusively form of pure abstraction, and I won't participate in that group. You won't miss me. It was clear for Torres that the opposition between abstraction and figuration is badly grounded, is groundless. He knew that, and then he really elaborated that later on, that you could be concrete or abstract with the same elements. With the same compositional and constructive elements, you have the choice of being concrete and to refer to reality or abstract. And then he really developed that to an obsessive way. At the end, he produces we have this beautiful little booklet where he does at each page the concrete and the abstract version of a composition with the same elements. And in these paintings in 1935 and 1938 in Montevideo, which I think are among the most impressive repertoires of abstractions ever done by an artist in the Americas at that time, but the tectonic presence of the image is actually the image of the construction that is there. And they are abstract, but they are absolutely concrete in their architectural presence. And that is absolutely a very interesting aspect in Torres' thinking and art.
Let me turn this over to all of you now to ask any questions that you might have. Please don't be at all shy or hesitant, or Luis and I will have to tell jokes up here.
We'll need to start speaking Spanish.
That will be a joke in my case. Yes, over there, I see a hand. Hold on, we're going to send a microphone so we can hear you.
Could you comment on his relationship to Picasso and link it somehow to the show
Yes.
that's on now here?
Well, it's an interesting question. You have to know that Torres-Garcia is one of the major artists in the Catalan art scene in 1910, 1913. That since the late 19th century, he is gathering at El Quatre Cats with Jean Picasso and Jean Miró and Joan González and Julio González, that he is at the core of Catalan modernism, which is the source of the first Picasso. But Torres is older than almost all of them. He was born in 1874. He's an adult in 1900. And he stays in Barcelona. Picasso leaves. Miró leaves. Then in 1917, he sees Parade. And he writes this exhilarating review of Parade in Catalan. He's fascinated by Parade. And in 1918, when the commission of the Frescoes is cancelled, and it's the beginning of the First World War, he kind of starts wondering where he is going to go. At that moment, he's frustrated by what had happened in Barcelona around him. He thinks that he should go to Paris, and that he should meet Picasso. And so he goes there, and the Jean Miró arranges everything and finds a hotel for Torres and waits for him in the train station and brings him to Picasso. Picasso, we did not know what happened, but it did not go well. We know that Torres brought the studies for the frescoes that he might have had some kind of relationship with what Picasso had done for Parade, and he was right. Picasso kind of ignores him a little bit, and he's frustrated, and then he comes to New York. But he continues kind of a relationship with Picasso. In 1932, he's with Julio González in Paris, and accidentally Picasso is there, making these sculptures that are beautifully exhibited in the fourth floor here. And Julio González was extremely close to Torres. They were almost family. And Picasso proposes Torres to write a book on him. And Torres accepts enthusiastically and even designs a cover, which we saw at the Museo Torres-Garcia in Montevideo. We were kind of, should we bring this? And then never answers anymore, and the project fails. So I have to say that on one hand, this is a hypothesis. Picasso saw in Torres a major figure of his youth, but he probably thought that he had left that moment and that Torres has somehow stayed there. And we also have to say that Torres-Garcia was not an easy character. He was very confrontational in a way. He was very sure of his positions, and so that was it. On the contrary to Mondrian, for example, or Jean Arp, they were very close. They were almost family. Torres would go to the Arps every week in Paris. Then he continued to have correspondence with them until very late, as well as he continued to have correspondence with Mondrian, and the letters from the 1930s and 40s are in Montevideo. So even if Torres left Cercle Carré and decided to leave Paris and to go back to Uruguay, he continued to have correspondence with them. But Picasso was kind of an interesting and frustrating moment in his life.
Other questions? Please.
Could you expand a little bit on the connection, possible connection between Torres-Garcia's books and the Atlas of Forms of Abby Warburg?
Well, that's like music to my ears, because I am obsessed with.
How many hours do you have?
I think that there is this fascinating moment in Europe around 1929, 1932. You have Abby Warburg producing the unfinished Mnemosyne album, a fairy tale, the fairy tale version of our history without words, a fairy tale for adults, as he would say. But you have also Carl Einstein looking at primitive art, and you have Frank Boas really demonstrating that what we call primitive is not primitive. And you have Walter Benjamin thinking of the density of time at the same time, and at the same time you have Torres-Garcia thinking without words, visually, formally, about the countless connections that you can establish between the anonymous and the modern, the classical and the technical, notably on that Structures album that Glenn was talking about before. And although the other books are also, in a way, argumental compositions with words and images, I think Torres-Garcia had an early intuition that is a Baudelairean intuition that beauty or art lays in the fleeting and in the eternal at the same time, and that the challenge is how to embrace both what is there and has been there forever, and what goes and passes. And one of the beautiful articles of Torres at the early is the man who passes, the man who goes. Well, so there is this connection, a generational connection, and also an epochal connection, and an intellectual connection. And what is a revelation is that Torres took part of that group, and that produced at least one kind of album that really connects to these major contributions at that moment, not to mention the other books and the manifestos about art and nature, and the constructive as universal, as something that Torres was convinced that there is something that he would call an anonymous rule that does not belong to anyone, and that actually surfaces at every single significant symbolic production in time, no matter where you are. And that an anonymous rule goes back beyond what you can know and will go over to the future. It's both the utopian projection and the invention of the past. And this makes him particularly fascinating. And I think he has something to say at that moment for that with the kind of problems.
But wouldn't you say, Luis, that in the case of Warburg, the atlas aspires to a universalism? It endeavors to be as inclusive in its arc of interests as possible, whereas Torres-Garcia sought to include the universal in the singular object. In other words, it's the difference between the art historian
Yes.
mapping and the artist creating.
Yes. That is definitely true, and I think that's a major distinction. But also, Glenn, I think that both of them coincided with this idea that whatever antiquity is, and antiquity is forever lost, it emerges, the Nachleben, it comes back at this very present moment, embodied by these very present subjects. So the pathetic force of art, the possibility of art to convince you, lays in this potentiality for what is lost to reappear at this very present moment. So that's the whole thing of Warburg about the pathos formula and the only way the people from Florence in 1530 could have to imagine what antiquity was the pageant festivities in the streets, carnival, and collective popular parties. And so I think Torres too, at least there is Nachleben, there is the coming back of something we don't know up to that moment. But Torres is very clear that that the challenge is to understand what is the present form of that.
Is there another and last question? Yes, please.
Spanish.
It's fine.
¿Cómo fue el impacto que recibió Torres-Garcia en Nueva York y cuál fue el vínculo que desarrolló con los artistas y con los intelectuales del momento?
So the question is, Martín Casillo asks, what was the impact, what was the influence that Torres-Garcia got in New York, and what kind of relationships he had at that time with the intellectual world in New York? Well, you know, he comes here and Walter Pax.
In español. Answer.
Español, sí.
No, you.
Torres-Garcia llega a Nueva York en esos tempranos años 20 e inmediatamente se encuentra en el corazón de la escena intelectual y artística neoyorquina de esos años. El libro manuscrito de Nueva York, que fue publicado, magníficamente editado por Juan Flo y por el Museo Torres-Garcia, y que el original está aquí ustedes ven allí el entusiasmo de Torres-Garcia con la modernidad de Torres-Garcia. Prácticamente dice: se acabó Europa, ya yo no soy más, no me interesa, el mundo es Nueva York. Y luego comienza a ver la frustración y el cansancio de la ciudad que lo atosiga, del mundo del comercio, de la industria, y tiene la osadía de estar al mismo tiempo trabajando como artista en los medios intelectuales más sofisticados, con Catherine Dreier, la Société Anonyme, con la señora Vanderbilt Whitney y la Sociedad de los Artistas Independientes, de estar trabajando para Broadway y produciendo escenas para Broadway, de estar pensando en advertising y en publicidad, y de producir juguetes y de tratar de producirlos industrialmente. Es decir, él quiere realmente encarnar el destino americano completo Nueva York, ¿no? Es comisionado obras decorativas para JP Morgan y no sé por qué razón lo que presenta es un retrato de Santa Teresa, obviamente eso era ya un llamado al fracaso. Intenta trabajar en la Catedral San Patricio, que realmente es una especie como de figura multidimensional y bueno, el periodo neoyorquino es muy breve, como ustedes saben, y él regresa a Europa un poco en desencanto y regresa a una Europa muy complicada, porque llega a Génova, a Livorno, y lo que ves son las manadas de fascistas que están pasando y ya comienza a incubarse pues, la tragedia de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, que es últimamente lo que lo va a llevar a retornar a América.
He really does speak Spanish. Thank you all for joining us. And once again, a salute to Luis and Karen and all who worked on this great exhibition.
Thank you, Glenn.